This video will be a follow-up to Saturday's video, where we discuss a couple of potential timelines if Rome instead lost the Second Punic War. If I explore today's scenario in full, I would likely be repeating things that I said in that video a number of times. Still, a Carthaginian victory in the First Punic War, rather than the Second, could still lead to a dramatically different timeline than a victory in the Second, as we will soon see. Now, in pure theory, Carthage can rather easily win the First Punic War. They started it with complete naval supremacy, and if they used this massive advantage to go big, organize a response, and send all they could muster to fight the Romans immediately, they might have been able to achieve a quick victory. Yet, this didn't happen. Carthage was unprepared and slow, as Rome took the initiative immediately. Swift and decisive action is just not in Carthage's nature. So, I would put my best shot for a Carthaginian victory 14 years into the conflict. The Romans were besieging Lilybaeum, one of the final Carthaginian vestiges on Sicily. The Roman navies attempted to blockade the fort, and the Carthaginian navy, in their greatest victory of the war, smashed and destroyed Rome's fleet. Meanwhile, Carthage's greatest general, Hamilcar Barca, was successfully waging a guerrilla war against the Romans on the island. So, what did Carthage do with their massive naval advantage now? They sent their navies back to the ports to save on money. Now, on the surface, this move was understandable. They were literally going bankrupt. The Carthaginian Senate had basically given up on the war by this point, and they practically didn't reinforce Hamilcar's efforts on Sicily. Instead, they sat and waited as Rome rebuilt their fleets. Carthage went on for a final attempt to resupply and fight in Sicily, yet they were intercepted and destroyed by Rome. The Carthaginian Senate decided to surrender, and in the peace deal, they had to give up Sicily and pay extremely crippling war reparations. But what if instead, after this destruction of the Roman navy, Carthage put everything they had into the conflict one last time? Yes, Carthage was going bankrupt, but so was Rome. They had already lost an estimated 17% of military-aged men during this conflict, and building fleet after fleet isn't cheap. Carthage establishes naval supremacy again, while Hamilcar starts raiding and fighting in Sicily, and even pesters southern Italian cities. Militarily, Hamilcar isn't taking all of Sicily back easily, but if we keep this up in this alternate timeline, perhaps with a couple more Roman fleets being built and destroyed, and Carthage might start breaking through as the undersupplied Roman legions start to be seriously driven back. Broke and with victory out of sight, Rome starts seeking a peace treaty. The treaty would be very mild on Rome. Carthage isn't yet threatening Rome itself, and it is well known that they are struggling financially as well. Rather, the treaty re-establishes the pre-war status quo on Sicily, with potentially some symbolic but minor war reparations placed on Rome. The post-war world is completely different. More than 20 years of conflict has left both sides exhausted. For Rome though, while there would be some rumbling amongst the indebted elites, there isn't an immediate issue. But for Carthage, much like in our own timeline, they mostly relied on a mercenary army which they wouldn't be able to pay in full. Thus, much like in our timeline, Carthage faces a revolt of mercenaries, as well as revolts in other parts of the empire. In an extreme scenario, Rome might immediately join the revolters to try another war with Carthage. More likely though, Rome simply uses the instability to halt any war reparations they were paying, while beginning to note down Carthage's weaknesses, because Rome would try again. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. So, after yet more years of war, Carthage has managed to suppress the revolts and regained control over their empire. But now, importantly, Hamilcar doesn't go on his conquest of Iberia. He did this in our timeline to get the silver mines of the region under his control, using that income to repay the massive war reparations that Rome had demanded. In our timeline, expansion into Iberia was quite possibly the only way to save Carthage from ruin. That is simply not the case here. It is very possible that Carthage doesn't, or only minorly, expands into Iberia. For most of the Carthaginian nobles, the dispute was simply solved and they had won. The Romans were humbled, their fleets were destroyed, and Carthage ruled the Mediterranean again. From the Roman perspective though, nothing could be further from the truth. Little energy is spent on anything but preparing for another major war, as Rome rebuilds their armies and navies. The lead up could take decades, but eventually Rome would decide that they can try again. While Rome was preparing though, Carthage did very little. Hamilcar would spend his time building up defenses in Sicily, but besides that, Carthage is underprepared for any conflict. Now, unlike the First War, where Rome entered without a proper navy or a real plan, Rome and Carthage immediately clash on the seas, with Rome likely achieving some victories. While Rome would absolutely launch another invasion of Sicily, facing off against Hannibal and Hamilcar Barca there, the Roman scope is quite possibly bigger here. Potential invasions of Sardinia and Corsica, possibly allying with independence fighters there. A potential front against Carthaginian Iberia would be opened, and if possible, Rome would even try to find allies in Africa to fight Carthage with. Soon after the war started, Carthage is hit with a barrage of Roman pressure. And while Hannibal would still be a decent general, taking after his father, he has now lacked the experience he gained fighting in southern Iberia in our timeline. Hannibal is still likely to do very well at whatever front Carthage gives him, but Hannibal is now fighting a defensive war, where he would be far less devastating than while rampaging around Italia in our own timeline. It would be like Carthage having one amazing goalkeeper, but Rome shooting 3 balls at the same time. It is not guaranteed that Rome would be successful in this conflict, but in my opinion, they do hold all the advantages. So, while Carthage does fine in Sicily, where Hannibal is holding the line, Rome is achieving victories in Iberia, slowly strangling the Carthaginians in a battle of willpower and determination. While Carthage manages to clutch the victory in the First War, I would still put my money on Rome for the follow-up. Assuming Rome does win, it almost looks like a return to her own timeline, but there would be some major changes. For one, Hannibal has never gone to Italia. Both Punic Wars, even despite having lost the first one, have been completely offensive wars for Rome. Besides that though, Rome's victory has once again come later. As we've explored in the previous victory, a delay in Roman involvement in the eastern Mediterranean could have major consequences for the balance of power there. Finally, where in our timeline, after the Second Punic War, Carthage was a shell of his former self, and the Third War was literally a free victory for the Romans, that is possibly not the case here. Once more, Rome would have to struggle with a final war against a fading nation, which is undoubtedly led gloriously to its final demise under Hannibal, who makes the final conquest of Africa as painful for Rome as he can. So, there we have it. A Carthaginian victory in the First Punic War, which would likely be a relatively minor one, would likely still lead to Rome dominating the Western Mediterranean. Only if Carthage significantly reforms after their victory, which is very unlikely, this fate may be avoided. Still, as mentioned before, there could be up to a 50-year delay in Roman hegemony over the Western Mediterranean, easily resulting in a radically different future for the Mediterranean, and with it, the world. So, if you're interested, click the video on top to watch the episode about the Second Punic War. Also consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. Alternatively, you can click the video below, where I try to explain why it is so difficult to have Carthage achieve a victory in either of the Punic Wars. Either way, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.